many of us are just peripheral readers, come to relate him with ethics, come to relate or even equate him with ethics. We further learned with our colleagues, starting yesterday until today, that this ethics is neither the branch, nor the system, nor even an embodiment of specific codes of ethics. It is not our usual essentialist ethics. Now, for this particular session, we will listen to Levinas and aesthetics. So we can now relate two big words in philosophy: ethics and aesthetics. I am led to observe the significance of the S. It's not ethic, it's not aesthetic. It's aesthetics and ethics. So I ask, is it simply accidental that ethics and aesthetics end in S, taking the plural form of a regular English noun? Does the Levinasian anti-essentialist ethics extend as well to an anti-foundationalist aesthetics? So with these simple questions, let us listen to our speakers. So let me introduce first the first speaker for this afternoon. He is our department chair. Dr. Bolaños is the chairperson of the Department of Philosophy, Faculty of Arts and Letters, and Philosophy Program Lead at the Graduate School. He obtained his AP Philosophy from UST, his MA in Philosophy from Brock University, Canada, and his PhD in Philosophy from Macquarie University, Australia. Dr. Bolaños' areas of expertise are mainly on Nietzsche, Adorno, Deleuze, Frankfurt School Critical Theory, and Post-Marxism. He is the author of On Affirmation and Becoming, a Delusion Introduction to Nietzsche's Ethics and Ontology, published by Cambridge Scholars Publishing in 2014. Dr. Bolaños is also the editor of Critique, an online journal of philosophy, and editorial consultant of Zurich, Journal of the Philosophical Association of the Philippines. He is board member of the Philosophical Association of the Philippines and the youngest member of the Philippine Academy of Philosophical Research. To talk about Adorno and Levinas on the compatibility between aesthetics and ethics, let us welcome Dr. Paolo Bolaños.
Thank you for the introduction, Franz. So good afternoon, everyone. I hope that you're having a wonderful time here in UST, listening to different lectures, presentations on the philosophy of Levinas and other philosophers. The title of the short paper that I'm going to read to you this afternoon is Adorno and Levinas on the compatibility between aesthetics and ethics. As Franz mentioned earlier, we usually associate Levinas with ethics, but rarely do we talk about him in the context of aesthetics. So perhaps this is an opportunity for us to, explore a bit what Levinas has to say about aesthetics. Franz also said that most of us are peripheral readers of Levinas. I am also a peripheral reader of Levinas. I don't claim to be an expert on Levinas. So you will realize as you listen to me that I will talk more about Adorno than Levinas. I try to strike a balance, but it tipped towards Adorno because my argument in the paper is that Adorno could actually provide Levinas with a more or less convincing, theory of art. And so I apologize if the paper will be somewhat critical of Levinas. Now the relationship between, just to preface my talk, the relationship between Levinas and Adorno is not well explored, but there are several articles and books that tackle the relationship, and we can actually identify at least three affinities between the two philosophers. The first one is that because of their common Jewish background, they have similar views about religion and theology. And there's actually a very thick book on it called Minimal Theology, which you might want to consult. The second is the common experience with Auschwitz. We have here two philosophers whose works are profoundly grounded in their experiences with the Holocaust. And I want to say also that even their aesthetics and ethics are influenced by their experience of Auschwitz. The third commonality or affinity is, of course, this is what I'm going to talk about today, their views on ethics and aesthetics. Now, the debate on the respective positions of Theodore Adorno and Emmanuel Levinas on the relationship between aesthetics and ethics is divided into two camps. Despite the fact that Adorno and Levinas' works are arguably responses to the event of Auschwitz, there are those who argue that Adorno evinces an exclusively aesthetic response, while Levinas propounds a deeply ethical response. It would seem then that the two philosophers advance two mutually exclusive responses. On the exclusivity of these responses, commentators maintain that Adorno provides a response that tarries in the post-human, while Levinas remains in the encounter between human beings, the face-to-face encounter, which by now you're very well familiar with already. In the short and, I must say, preliminary paper, that in here is final, I will argue that aesthetics and ethics are not mutually exclusive, contrary to the common claim of commentators. While I am aware that indeed Adorno and Levinas proceed from profoundly distinct standpoints and philosophical styles, they nevertheless intersect precisely at the sweet spot between aesthetics and ethics. The incompatibility, therefore, between these two responses is superficial, and that a deeper dialogue between the two philosophers would result in their symbiotic expansion. Levinas and his ambivalence towards art. Now, commenting on the nature of work, like the artwork, Levinas himself, in Totality and Infinity, polarizes aesthetics and ethics. He writes, and I quote, "When we understand man on the basis of his works, he is more surprised than understood. His life and his labor mask him. As symbols, they call for interpretation." End of quote. If we follow Levinas, the artwork then is distinguished from the expression of the artist or the artisan. So he makes the distinction. The artist is different from the artwork. Right? Levinas further remarks that, I quote, "To be attentive is to recognize the mastery of the other, to receive his command, or more exactly, to receive from him the command to command," end of quote. Despite the possibility of being attentive, Levinas seems to be telling us that such attentiveness is only possible in the presence of the other. That is, the presence of the artist. Based on these declarations by Levinas, one may infer that for him, the ethical moment is not possible through the work of art. It is only possible if we indeed engage face-to-face with the artist, but not with the artwork. So, for him, the ethical moment is not possible through the artwork. And if it is ever possible, the artwork will not be able to sustain it. Right? Because as he talks about art, the beauty of art, the beautiful art rather, carrying goodness, right? He borrows it from Plato. However, he does also say that that cannot be sustained by the work of art itself. In a 1982 interview with Edith Visegrad, I don't know if I pronounced it correctly, but in that interview, Levinas was asked whether he deliberately shifted from phenomenology to language, because all of a sudden he would talk about the significance of language in the face-to-face. And so the interviewer inquired whether there's a shift in his philosophical approach. Did he abandon phenomenology and then started to talk about his ethics via language, that is, the written language? So he was asked whether he shifted from phenomenology to language and his articulation of the ethics of the other. While Levinas responds in the negative, he says no, there's no shift. He does mention that, I quote, the ethical moment is in the saying, end of quote. There is therefore, so he emphasizes the saying, right? There is therefore an important nuance between saying and the said. So there's a difference between saying and the said. Levinas attributes to saying the actual presence, that is to say, the expression, right, the lively expression of the other. The context of the art, the lively expression of the artist. While the said is to be static artwork that is not capable of self-expression. It is nevertheless curious that Levinas attributes to poetry the character of saying, inasmuch as poetry carries with it the good. So, this reminds us, of course, of the Platonic conflation of the good and the beautiful. Right? We are all familiar with that. A la Plato, Levinas sees poetry as a fleeting carry of the good, however. For Levinas, art must remain a shadow of reality. That is to say, subordinate to reality. And he says this in an essay he wrote, which he called Reality and Its Shadow. And in that essay, he says, he warns us rather, about the egoistic tendency of the art for art's sake attitude. He says, in an essay, I quote, the formula is false, the art for art's sake approach or formula is false, inasmuch as it situates art above reality and recognizes no master for it. And it is immoral inasmuch as it liberates the artist from his duties as a man and assures him of a pretentious and facile nobility. End of quote. In addition to the egoistic tendency, Levinas also objects to the disengaging movement of art, the separation of art from reality, inasmuch as artwork is an artifice and not a real thing. It's an artificial thing. So that a painting is not real. We know that it's artificial. A statue is not real. We know that it's artificial. Levinas criticizes the common conception that the artwork is a form of expression or a form of saying. In other words, an artwork, a static and inert object, is not capable of the straightforwardness of the face-to-face. He writes in Totality and Infinity, I quote, what we call the face is precisely this exceptional presentation of self by self, so man and man, incommensurable with the presentation of reality simply given. To seek truth, I have already established a relationship with a face which can guarantee itself, whose epiphany itself is somehow a word of honor. Every language, as an exchange of signs, refers already to this primordial world of honor. The verbal sign is placed where someone signifies something to someone. It therefore already presupposes an authentication of the signifier. So what is emphasized here, however, is the capacity of the person, the human being, or the artist to say something, right? To engage in conversation, which for Levinas an artwork cannot do. Now, according to a commentator named Stephanie Belmer, there is an intriguing inconsistency in Levinas' treatment of art and its relation to the ethical encounter. She says that Levinas goes back and forth between the exclusivity of the ethical encounter, the face-to-face encounter between two human beings, and the potential of art to elicit the ethical. As such, Levinas seems to evince some degree of ambivalence when it comes to his treatment of the nature of art. That's why the subtitle of this section is Levinas' ambivalence towards art. It is quite interesting that Belmer claims that Levinas actually implicitly ascribes to art the ethical dimension, but he was not able to develop the proper theory to make it more explicit. So, actually, so what Belmer is saying, well, Levinas understands the nature of art. It's just that he wasn't able to articulate what he actually meant by art. In other words, there is an implicit, I call this, in Levinas, there is this implicit attempt to ascribe to art the possibility of the ethical. Just to rehearse Belmer's argument briefly, Levinas, according to her, is bound to a classical conception of beauty, the Platonic conception of beauty. Moreover, the work of art replaces the living subject, and as such is not capable of eliciting the ethical relation. Meanwhile, another Levinas commentator, Donald Blumenfeld, thinks that Levinas is mistaken in his generalizations about art, because Levinas does not distinguish between, on the one hand, the process of making art, and on the other hand, the experience of encountering art. So these criticisms are not mine, so don't get mad at me for my critical comments on Levinas. I just borrowed them. I'm not the one saying, okay, the criticisms. Blumenfeld suggests that because Levinas is too preoccupied with the experience of encountering art, he fails to make sense of the process of making art, which for Blumenfeld manifests in two ways. One, when we create art professionally, or the career-oriented way of creating art. Okay? And the art for art's sake approach is, of course, embedded there. And that's the kind of attitude that Levinas is actually criticizing. The other way of creating art is a way of relating to reality that allows us to develop what we can call aesthetic consciousness. Aesthetic consciousness, Blumenfeld maintains, has parallels with Levinas' description of the ethical relationship, living in ethical consciousness. In other words, the artist, through the process of creation, develops a deep relation with his or her surrounding environment, as opposed to Levinas' conviction that the artist disengages himself or herself from reality. So on the contrary, when we create art, we actually become closer to our environment. we develop a sense of an aesthetic consciousness. Now I move from Levinas to Adorno. So hopefully you get a sense of the position of Levinas, right? Now, is that position of Levinas sustained all throughout his works? That's precisely why I want to talk about aesthetics and Levinas, because there is an ambivalence. He does not sustain it. He moves, from criticizing art to salvaging art and so on. So it's a very, very interesting dialectical reading of Levinas. This section is called Adorno and the Non-Identical in Art. Adorno had devoted more than half of his works to the critical analysis of the critical potential of the artwork. His reflections on the critical role of aesthetics culminate in the posthumous and unfinished work called Aesthetic Theory, published in 1970 and translated as Aesthetic Theory in 1997. In Aesthetic Theory, which is a very difficult book, due partly to its unfinished nature and largely from its atonal structure. You don't know where to begin. Okay, that's something that Adorno shares with Nietzsche. When you start reading these philosophers, you don't know where to begin. But that, this is a side comment, but that's precisely the strength of their works. Adorno follows a fundamental insight from Karl Marx that art is normatively embedded in society as a whole. Based on this Marxist insight, Adorno elaborates on two fundamental assumptions which seem to be contradictory. First is that art in general shapes our utopian visions or utopian sensibilities, and as such, art plays a major role in our collective vision of reality. So that insight will enable us to imagine, to think about art not as separate from reality. On the contrary, art shapes our reality. The second presupposition of Adorno speaks of a rather vague notion of autonomy, the autonomy of the work of art, which becomes the basis for art's social character and art's critical role. More specifically, he says, I quote, "Art is the social antithesis of society." End of quote. The nature of art then is ambivalent. While it is normatively grounded in culture and hence vulnerable to the exploitation of what Adorno calls the culture industry, capitalism, right? Art, however, or nevertheless, art still plays a very important role in the prognosis of the dysfunctional nature of a purely functional society. Adorno emphasizes the non-identical, that is negative, the negative character of the artwork that serves as the basis for its critical potential. So art is a critical alternative to the culture industry because it is fundamentally negative, according to Adorno. The critical role of art, as opposed to mere entertainment, is based on Adorno's claim that art has a truth content. The German is Wahrheitsgehalt. By truth content, Adorno means the dialectical, right? For Adorno, truth is dialectical. And in the specific context of art, the dialectical potential of the artwork. So when Adorno talks about truth, he's not referring to truth as correspondence, this correspondence between, thing and mind and so on. He's talking about the dialectical nature of truth. Okay, the truth-seeking. Okay, the dialectical in this context means the ability of the artwork to incite critique and action. The truth content of a work of art inheres in the determinate negation of untruth, according to Adorno. It's very interesting. The truth content, the dialectical nature of art inheres in the determinate negation of untruth. Indeed, art must be consistent with Adorno's negative dialectics. It is in the sense that art is a counter-pressure to society, a society obsessed with identity. Adorno maintains that art has the character of seeking, I quote, to aid the non-identical, which in reality is repressed by reality's compulsion to identity. End quote. And Adorno further argues that art must confront the dialectical, or the dialectic of enlightenment, with the aesthetic conception of anti-art. And the source of its power of resistance is that a realized materialism would be at the same time the abolition of the domination of material interests. And the more utopia is blocked by the real function of order, the more this is true. Yet at the same time, art may not be utopia in order not to betray it by providing semblance and consolation. If the utopia of art were fulfilled, it would be art's temporal end. End quote. So art creates a dimension of imagined freedom. Okay? We can actually think of the utopian vision of Adorno via aesthetics or via the artwork as the possibility of imagining freedom. He does talk about in negative dialectics, he does talk about the vague notion of the good life, although he does not identify what that good life is exactly. Such freedom is sensitive to the negative position of critique toward both nature and non-nature. The dimension of utopia that art creates is not a positive one. In fact, it is a moment when a lack is realized. So, what an artwork exposes is not something positive, not necessarily beautiful, not necessarily the good, but it can expose a lack, right? It can expose, and Adorno has another word for this. He calls it the exposure of the damaged life, okay? The exposure of the wrong state of things, he says. In this sense, art is negative. As a critique of a society damaged by reification, art amounts to the exposure of the untruthfulness of the whole. Now, he plays a bit with Heidegger's notion of aletheia, right? I hope that you're familiar with the notion of aletheia, which means disclosure. What is disclosed is not necessarily positive or affirmative, but what is disclosed through art, according to Adorno, is precisely damaged life. Right? So it says art exposes the untruthfulness of the whole, and he also plays with the Hegelian idea of totality. It should remain negative. So art should remain negative, so it would not betray its function as a constant reminder that reason's attempt to ground and conquer nature through reason is actually hubris. Adorno also notes, I quote, artworks are after images of empirical life insofar as they help the latter to what is denied them outside their own sphere and thereby free it from that to which they condemn by reified external experience. End of quote. Now, the role of art, therefore, is a reminder of a lack, that the present society lacks something, right? The wrong state of things. This reality, so in other words, for Adorno, a work of art does not necessarily paint society as beautiful. Okay? This realization of a lack is the precondition of social critique. An artwork can present itself as an opposition to the present and thus opens up the present to the future. So dialectically, we can only move towards the future if we are able to sort of realize the lack of the present. The future is the realm of hope. The future, however, is perhaps more problematic for Adorno, for the space that hope creates does not guarantee that the future will be better than the present. The most that art can do for us is to aid us in our battle against total reification and to arouse a sort of nostalgia without content. A kind of ungroundable hope. This is the most that art can do for us, for even art can be commodified. And the commodification of art is criticized by both Levinas and Adorno. In this day and age, art is indeed a commodity, right? And I quote Adorno, the artwork, Adorno writes, is semblance not only as the antithesis to existence, but also in its own terms, end of quote. Now further, the non-identical character of the artwork also refers to the dynamic as opposed to the static and inert nature of the artwork. For Adorno, an artwork is not necessarily beautiful in form, I mentioned that earlier, as it could have a very engaging effect, right? Such as in Dada art, or more recently in shock art. The younger people are familiar with this. I'm familiar with it. Art, therefore, does not necessarily always enchant, because that's the word of Levinas. Art enchants, right? So art does not necessarily always enchant, as Levinas claims, but art could also appall. Art could also disgust. It can also upset its receivers. As such, for Adorno, the critical reception of an artwork is not simply a passive acquiescing of the rhythmic beauty, another word from Levinas, the rhythmic beauty of art, or inner goodness of the artwork. Rather, Adorno emphasizes the involvement of the receiver of the artwork in the artwork itself as a non-identical object. Now, this idea of non-identity is very, very interesting, because that's precisely the idea that we could use to tie Adorno with Levinas. As opposed to an escape, Levinas is also fond of the word escape, right? For Adorno, the work of art demands attention. But interestingly enough, artworks are enigmas asking to be interpreted, and yet at the same time refusing every interpretation. Because any interpretation is incomplete. And so that's the reason why Adorno thinks that the artwork is fundamentally negative. At the end, even if one dialectically engages with the artwork, one cannot fully identify with the artwork. It remains non-identical. It gives more than what one initially recognizes. That's another way of understanding Adorno's notion of non-identity. When an object gives more than what you can actually understand. But it's giving more. The artwork gives more. Transcendence in art. This is, okay, my last section, so you could already express your sighs of relief. Oh no, it's my second to last, sorry. Yeah, you can revoke your sighs. Transcendence in art. As opposed to the reductive stance of Levinas, for Adorno, each artwork has its own internal dialectical dynamics. Each artwork has its own internal contradictions, inasmuch as content and form, in Hout, content, are dialectically in clash, in Hout and form. It is precisely this internal dialectics that an artwork features that invites our critical judgments about its truthfulness or lack of it. The reason why we can talk about art, the reason why there is art criticism, is precisely because the artwork is dynamic. It has its internal contradictions. Following Hegel, Adorno notes that each artwork is not an isolated case, insulated from the concerns of the social and political sphere. On the contrary, the internal dynamics of an artwork reflect that of the dynamics of the totality of its social and political environment. And this is he borrows this from Hegel, which is in contradistinction to Kant's, idea of the role of art or the nature of art. The artwork has an internal truth content to the extent that the artwork's import can be found internally and externally either true or false. Such truth content is not a metaphysical idea or essence hovering outside the artwork, but neither is it a merely human construct. It is historical but not arbitrary, non-propositional yet calling for propositional claims to be made about it. Utopian in its reach, yet firmly tied to specific societal conditions. Truth content is the way in which an artwork simultaneously challenges the way things are and suggests how things could be better, but leaves things practically unchanged. To quote Adorno, this is lengthy, I quote, from aesthetic theory, the definition of art is not fully encompassed by aesthetic semblance. Art has truth as a semblance of the illusionless. The experience of artworks has its vanishing point, the recognition that its truth content is not null. Every artwork, and most of all works of absolute negativity, mutely say, non confundar. Artworks would be powerless if they were no more than longing, if they just enchant. Though there is no valid artwork without longing. But enchantment is also a role of art. It's part of the aesthetic experience. That by which they transcend longing, however, is the neediness inscribed as a figure in the historically existing. End of quote. Now, my last section. Now you can really express your sides. I wish to argue that even within, now the title of this section is The Ethics of Thinking, which is my own formulation. Now what is this ethics of thinking? I wish to argue that even within the framework of his aesthetic theory, Adorno is propounding what I call the ethics of thinking. The ethics of thinking is a kind of thinking that is receptive to the non-identical character of the world of human and non-human objects. The ethics of thinking is linked to aesthetic experience in as much as the redemptive dimension of what Adorno calls mimesis is only gleaned from an emphatic immersion into damaged life. Unfortunately, I don't have time to talk about this idea of mimesis, but it's also a very interesting notion. The experience of damaged life brings to the fore the moments of critical disclosure, possibility and creativity, and even redemption. Going back to Levinas, and this is my closing paragraph. Going back to Levinas, we could find a similarity between his notion of the alterity of the face and Adorno's notion of the non-identical character of the artwork. By considering the dynamic structure that Adorno ascribes to artworks, it is possible to posit an alternative model of ethics that resembles that of Levinas. Through Adorno, we would be able to imagine an alternative space for ethics to occur. That, as a matter of fact, our encounter with the artwork can elicit some ethical, consciousness or whatever, what you want to call it. Inasmuch as the face-to-face encounter is a radical ethical stance. It's a very, very radical ethical stance. By virtue of its displacement of my privileged position as the overwhelming other confronts me. Okay, that's Levinas. The artwork for Adorno is also a site of alterity. You cannot fully grasp the object of art. But at the same time, that artwork could lead you to the possibility of disclosing the raw state of things, right? And that could incite action, possibility, or it could incite utopian visions. As such, both the face-to-face encounter and aesthetic encounter provide possibilities of resistance to oppression and complete interpretation. Because that's how I understand Levinas. The face-to-face as an ethical model is there so that you could perhaps avoid oppressing other people. It is possible then to speak of a compatibility between aesthetics and ethics in Adorno and Levinas because we experience the artwork as radically other, which is the artwork as a site of alterity. And we are confronted by the human being as a non-identical being. Thank you very much for your patience.
So we reserve our questions and comments after the second speaker. He is an assistant professor at the Ateneo de Manila University. He wrote a master's thesis on Emmanuel Levinas, and his dissertation project is on the philosophy of Maurice Blondel. To talk about Levinasian themes in the later films of the Dardenne Brothers. I don't know if I pronounce it correctly. Let's welcome Professor Jose Eduardo Calasanz.
Good afternoon to everyone. The human gaze, in which we can read simultaneously the desire to murder and its prohibition, is the same gaze which is cinema's vocation to capture, to take care. The ethical appearing of the image which is simultaneous with and in conflict with its aesthetic appearing. Emmanuel Levinas wrote that ethics is an optics of the face, relations among gazes that the images prohibit idolizing in reducing them to a plastic form. The human face as the first word, as the first address. This first entry in the Journal of Luc Dardenne, dated November 8, 1992. The journal is entitled At the Back of Our Images, 1991-2005. A second volume followed 2005 to 2014. This first entry, which mentions the name of Emmanuel Levinas, suggests the immense influence of the philosophy of Emmanuel Levinas on the cinematic work of Jean-Pierre and Luc Dardenne. This influence is notable in their first major film, The Promise, 1996. Luc Dardenne notes in his entry for January 19, 1996, Emmanuel Levinas died while we were filming The Promise. The Promise owes a lot to the reading of his books, his interpretation of the face-to-face, of the face as the initial discourse. The whole film can be seen as an attempt to finally reach this face-to-face. This is dated January 19, 1996. We all know that Emmanuel Levinas died on Christmas Day, 1995. The Promise, 1996. Rosetta, 1999. The Sun, 2002. And The Child, 2005, are all informed by the familiar Levinasian themes of truth and justice, ethics and the epiphany of the face, enjoyment and the asymmetry of the interpersonal, etc. These films have already been analyzed philosophically in important studies such as Susan Cooper's Mortal Ethics, Reading Levinas with the Dardenne Brothers, and Marc-Emmanuel Melon, Le Regard et l'Intrigue, or How to Reconstruct the Human Experience. The Dardenne Brothers have continued to make films, and the working thesis of this paper is that while maintaining the previous Levinasian themes already mentioned, the later films focus on themes which are highlighted in the later writings of Levinas, notably in Otherwise Than Being. The Silence of Lorna, 2008, The Kid with a Bike, 2011, 2 Days, 1 Night, 2014, and The Unknown Girl, 2016, shift the center of gravity, so to speak, from the epiphany of the face to the summons of responsibility to the point of substitution. One can understand, for example, the itinerary of the philosophical thought of Emmanuel Levinas as precisely this shift of the center of gravity, not a real in the manner of Heidegger, but a shift in the center of gravity from the epiphany of the face to the summons of responsibility to the point of substitution. In this paper, I would simply like to focus on two films, The Unknown Girl, 2016, and The Silence of Lorna, 2008, as illustrating two Levinasian themes: responsibility as obsession and responsibility as maternity. I had thought of having an opportunity to show these two films during this conference, but certain deontology issues were raised. But at any rate, I will leave copies of the two films with the Secretariat. And if you wish to copy them, you can assume responsibility for that. Okay, but I will leave copies of the two films with the Secretariat. You might say that this short paper is to parody a bit Susan Cooper's Mortal Ethics, Reading Levinas with the Dardenne Brothers. This paper is a bit like reading the Dardenne Brothers with Levinas. And notably, the later Levinas. The Unknown Girl tells of Dr. Jenny Dada, a young, hard-working physician in general medicine. I will summarize because most of us have not seen the films. No? She's at the crossroads of her career, with the possibility of a lucrative position at the big city clinic, or staying put to take over the reins from her retiring supervisor. One evening, while giving her intern a dressing down, she ignores a buzz on the clinic's intercom a decision that will overturn her well-ordered world and change the course of her life. CCTV footage, which the police asked to see the following day, shows a distressed African girl of unknown identity trying to get in. She turns out to be a local prostitute whose body has been found by the river with marks of a struggle and has to be buried in a common pauper's grave. Jenny cannot let this go. Seeing the face of the unknown girl in the CCTV footage is a moment of epiphany for her, and she sets out to run her own inquiry with the goal of discovering the identity of the victim, of ensuring that the latter's family knows her fate and that she is properly put to rest. Like a roving warrior, as one critic puts it, she sets out on a door-to-door mission to do the right thing, taking advantage of her medical rounds to achieve her goal. Why does she do it? No civil or moral law obliges her. She was well within her rights when she refused to open the door after clinic hours. It's like the epiphany of the face, right? It overturns everything. No? She was well within her rights when she refused to open her door after clinic hours. And yet, when a man asks Jenny, "Why should I screw up my life if she's already dead?" Jenny replies, "Because if she were dead, she wouldn't be on our minds." At the core of The Unknown Girl is the Levinasian notion of responsibility as obsession, traumatism, persecution. In a journal entry on December 23, 2011, Luc Dardenne notes that the viaticum, or wayfarer's bread, in the writing of the screenplay for this movie, was this footnote in chapter 3 of Otherwise Than Being, the chapter on sensibility and proximity. And I quote the footnote, "The soul is the other in me. The psyche, the one for the other, can be a possession or a psychosis. The soul is already a seed of folly. L'âme est déjà une graine de folie." Jenny is obsessed with the unknown girl, to whom she did not open the door of her clinic and her heart, and with good reasons. But responsibility is precisely not grounded in the reasons for responsibility. As Levinas puts it, "A neighbor concerns me outside of any a priori, but perhaps before every a priori, or from an earlier moment than that of the a priori." This is the notion all our inquiry means to bring out, so as to reach the concept of an absolute passivity, receptivity with regard to the given. A modality of cognition is not adequate for it, for precisely the a priori that cannot be excluded from it and lets all the weight of the given be welcome. This would still be an act. Pure and radical passivity before the distinction between freedom and unfreedom, between ignorance and knowledge, before or outside any intentionality. Levinas even has recourse to a surprising analogy with Leibniz's monadology. I quote, The obsession is like a relation between monads prior to the opening up of doors or windows in a counter direction from intentionality, which is a modality of obsession and nowise a development of this relationship. So for Levinas, let me just annotate this quotation again. For Levinas, the relationship with the other, the relationship with the face precisely, is not cognitive, and it is not structured according to intentionality. It's the way Husserl has described intentionality. In fact, rather than obsession being a mode of intentionality, okay, he reverses the relationship. He speaks of a counter direction from intentionality. It is intentionality which is a modality of obsession. I continue the quote. The expression by each monad of all the others, okay, for Leibniz, each monad precisely symbolizes, expresses all the others, the totality of monads. The exposition by each monad of all the others refers to substitution. It's the surprising analogy. For me, I find it surprising that he speaks of analogy as this expression of every individual monad, the singular monad of all the other monads. The expression by each monad of all the others refers to substitution, in which the identity of subjectivity is resolved. The ego, obsessed by all the others, supporting all the others, is an inversion of intentional ecstasy. In passivity, the ego is a self under a persecuting accusation of the neighbor. The image of Levinas, for example, of the self as Atlas carrying the weight of the world, or the favorite quotation of his from Dostoevsky's Brothers Karamazov, I am responsible for all, and I more than all the others. To ask why, how, or to what extent Jenny was responsible for the death of the unknown girl is to miss the whole thrust of Levinas's thought. As he puts it clearly, the neighbor concerns me before all assumption, all commitment consented to or refused. I am bound to him before any liaison contracted. He orders me before being recognized. It is not because the neighbor would be recognized as belonging to the same genus as me that he concerns me. He is precisely other. The community with him begins in my obligation to him. The neighbor is a brother, a fraternity that cannot be abrogated, an unimpeachable assignation or summons. Proximity is an impossibility to move away without the torsion of a complex, without alienation or fault. The insomnia is the psyche. The neighbor summons me before I designate him. This is a modality not of knowing, but of obsession. A shuddering or trembling. Levinas uses the word tressaillement. A shuddering of the human, quite different from cognition. In an approach, I am first a servant of the neighbor, already late and guilty for being late. I am, as it were, ordered from the outside, traumatically commanded, without interiorizing by representation and concepts the authority that commands me. We notice, as many commentators have already pointed out, the the hyperbolic rhetoric of Levinas, the use of the words like traumatism, persecution, etc. And I think precisely it's this hyperbolical rhetoric is to I think drive home literally the point. Without asking myself, what then is it to me? Where does he get his right to command? What have I done to be from the start in debt? In this context, just as he often quotes Dostoevsky's, I think it was Alyosha, who says in the Brothers Karamazov, I am responsible for all and I more than others. He loves in this context to quote from Hamlet. Okay? What is he to Hecuba, or Hecuba to him, that he should weep for her? Okay? If you remember, in Hamlet, Hamlet hires a group of players, and they put on a play, probably the Trojan Women of Euripides. And after the scene of Hecuba and the other Trojan women, one of the audience begins to weep. He's touched by the plight of Hecuba. And Hamlet asks, what is Hecuba to him, or Hecuba that he should weep for her? Okay. But precisely for Levinas, this original and originary relationship with the other is prior to any commitment or refusal of commitment, before any knowledge, before even any choice, precisely before the distinction between freedom and unfreedom. I go back to the text of Levinas. Obsession is not consciousness, nor a species or a modality of consciousness, even though it overwhelms the consciousness that tends to assume it. It is unassumable, like persecution. And that the whole problematic, precisely, of the later Levinas would be, in a certain sense, to balance, to nuance, to attenuate the hyperbolic character, precisely, of this responsibility. It will bring in the third party, it will bring in the equilibrium of justice, modifying his earlier understanding of justice and totality of infinity and infinity, okay, precisely to check, as it were, the radical violence, or at least the apparent violence of this responsibility, which goes all the way to substitution. In an entry on April 5, 2010, Luc Dardenne talks about the embryo of the screenplay of The Unknown Girl. The doctor, at a certain point of the inquiry, says to an interlocutor, referring to the unknown victim, "It's my daughter." Of course, the African girl has no relationship with the doctor, but he says, "It's my daughter." This theme of responsibility as maternity is precisely what is developed in an earlier film, The Silence of Lorna. So The Silence of Lorna is an earlier film, 2008, if I'm not mistaken. Lorna is a young woman from Albania, now residing in Belgium. The Dardenne Brothers are fond of showing the plight of immigrants and migrant workers in Belgium. So Lorna is a young woman from Albania, now residing in Belgium, a beneficiary and exploiter of the marriage for sale racket. We also have it in our country now. A drug addict named Claudie has married her for money. Lorna's manager, pimp if you want, Fabio, now plans to arrange for Claudie's death. A Russian will pay Lorna to marry him so he can obtain a Belgian passport. And then, Lorna believes she will be free to marry her longtime boyfriend, Sokol, and open a little cafe with him. It's Lorna's idea of the good life, eudaimonia, a little cafe. The whole film is a meditation, so to speak, on Lorna's silence. She knows of Fabio's plan to arrange for Claudie's death with an overdose. She attempts to save Claudie's life by getting a divorce. But in the end, she keeps silent when the inevitable must take place. I'll try to avoid spoilers. How she copes with this failure or refusal of responsibility is the burden of the second half of the film. But the first half is concerned with Lorna's slow awakening to the epiphany of the face of Claudie. An epiphany which introduces her to responsibility. Dardenne puts the problematic this way in the entry on June 6, 2006. The discovery of another, autrui, by Lorna. Another, essentially the poor one who is Claudie, in the face of Lorna, who has no regard, no word for him, other than the lying look and word which will allow the evil plan to succeed. Claudie, the sick one, the one who eats peelings, and Lorna, the girl in good health, in a hurry to succeed. How to lead her to him? How can she hear the voice of still silence of the one she despises? This voice to which she could respond, "The world is no longer. I must carry you." Dardenne then recounts the inspiration culled from a text of Jacques Roland, Murder and the Other in Dostoevsky, which is a Levinasian reading of Dostoevsky's novels. And I quote from Dardenne, "This little text is immense, a revelation. Thanks to it, we went back to Lorna and Claudie. The invisible film of this film will be the movement that opens up Lorna to Claudie, that opens her to what the sentence from Paul Celan says. The world is no longer. I must carry you. Le monde n'est plus. Il faut que je te porte." This opening up will take place sexually. She opens up her body to Claudie in a singular sexual encounter. But more than that, she opens herself ethically. Or rather, she finds herself already and always opened up ethically in responsibility for another. Even after Claudie's death, sorry for the spoiler, she feels responsible for him. A responsibility symbolized by her felt pregnancy. She feels she is pregnant. She goes to have an abortion, but changes her mind. To abort the child would be like killing Claudie a second time. She thinks she could redeem herself by having Claudie's child, but is told after an obstetrical examination that she is not pregnant after all. Or rather, she is pregnant, but with Claudie. She has Claudie, autrui, another, literally under her skin, in responsibility, which is the other in the same, l'autre dans le même, one for the other, l'un pour l'autre. The biological child may be a phantom and many critics and film reviewers of The Silence of Lorna point this out, much a reality. A palpable, weighty, literally weighty, even oppressive reality. In other words, the biological pregnancy as a symbol, okay, of this ethical responsibility experienced as one for the other in the same. In other words, an experience of maternity. Just as the individual, the singular monad symbolizes the totality of monads, the self in responsibility substitutes for all the others. As once more, Dostoevsky puts it, I am responsible for all, I more than the others. Levinas speaks of responsibility as being put in question. Levinas speaks of responsibility as being put in question by the alterity of the other. Before the intervention of a cause, even before the appearing of the other, it is a pre-original or pre-originary, not resting on oneself, the restlessness of someone persecuted. Where to be? How to be? Saan ko ilalagay ang sarili ko? Paano ako posisyon? In other words, it is these questions which responsibility awakens in us. Precisely, hindi ko alam kung paano ako posisyon. Hindi ko lang alam kung nasaan ako. It was as if iba na yung may hawak sa akin. And yet, before the distinction between freedom and unfreedom, it is a rhythm in the tight dimensions of pain, the unsuspected dimensions of the hither side. Levinas uses the expression, on the side. It is being torn up from oneself, being less than nothing, a rejection into the negative, behind nothingness. It is maternity, gestation of the other in the same. It's not the restlessness of someone persecuted, but a modification of maternity, the groaning of the wounded entrails by those it will bear or has borne. In maternity, what signifies is a responsibility for others. In other words, Levin's not saying that it's not simply equating, identifying responsibility with maternity with responsibility. The relationship, this identification, is by way of signification. In maternity, what signifies is a responsibility for others, to the point of substitution for others and suffering, both from the effect of persecution and from the persecuting itself, in which the persecutor sinks. Maternity, which is bearing par excellence, porte par excellence, bears even responsibility for the persecuting by the persecutor. One can read the same thread, the theme of maternity in all the later films. It's very much explicit in The Silence of Lorna, but one can read it, for example, in the other films, the kid with the bike, for example, and even in The Unknown Girl. I stop there. The films of the Dardenne Brothers have been recognized as masterpieces of contemporary cinema. A Palme d'Or for Rosetta and the Child in the Cannes Film Festival. The Dardenne Brothers are among the very few who have received the Palme d'Or twice. together with the Japanese Imamura, or if I'm not mistaken, Ken Loa, I'm not sure if I pronounce it correctly. So the Palme d'Or for Rosetta and the Child, the Cannes Film Festival, plus other awards also from the Cannes Film Festival for The Silence of Lorna and The Kid with a Bike. Articles in scholarly journals such as Film Philosophy, Religion and Film, etc. have attested to their philosophical and even religious or spiritual import. For those of you who might be interested, I suggest you take a look at these online journals with free access. Okay? Film Philosophy, just Google it. It's hosted by the University of Edinburgh. And then Religion and Faith. Okay? There are others, but these two online journals are a rich source, I think, for studies on philosophy and film. And in fact, in Film Philosophy, you have at least one special issue on Levinas. You have Susan Cooper's important article, but also studies on Levinasian readings, for example, of Claude Lanzmann, the director of the monumental TV series on the Shoah, Levinas and Charlie Chaplin, Levinas and Tarkovsky, etc. It's a way of studying a philosopher precisely via film. Okay? And it's here perhaps that we can articulate a little more clearly, a little more substantially also, the relationship precisely between aesthetics and ethics. The films of the Dardenne Brothers are inseparable from the thought of Emmanuel Levinas and can serve as a helpful introduction to and illustration of the great philosopher in whose memory we are gathered these days. Maraming salamat.
So we have some 20 minutes for a critical engagement with our two speakers. May we just ask two speakers to sit here in front. Professor Calasanz and Dr. Bolaños. Okay. So we can now start. So the usual mechanics. You just state your name and then the institution where you are coming from, and then be straightforward with your question. Okay. So who wants to start the ball rolling?
Good afternoon. With the two lectures, two papers just presented. From the first one and up to the second, I found a common theme or common reaction or common or some common non-reaction. For my view, I find aesthetics as it is doesn't really cannot really combine with ethics. However, with the mention earlier of the word mimesis, I remembered Bollinger and his three mimesis. the threefold mimesis. Paul wrote about the aesthetic experience. So this is where I think we can connect aesthetics with ethics, with the aesthetic experience. We can argue, I think, continuously within aesthetics about the intention of the artist, the painter, the composer, the filmmaker. And then we would critique the artwork, the art piece, the masterpiece, and recognize them through awards, Cannes Film Festival. Some would base their recognition for the artwork through Manila Film Fest, for example. What others would consider art, others would consider garbage. So some would collect art, and we wonder why they consider it art. Some would just consider it noise, virtual noise, or as sound only. I think, or as I reflected on the papers presented, there is a common ground between Adorno, Levinas, and Ricker, and the other philosophers who talked about art or aesthetics. They differ in their arguments, but there is somehow a common thread in all those. There is that singular experience among all of them. What I think, just a reflection, not necessarily a question. What art contributes to the world is that aesthetic experience, and that it is that which gathers us to that singular experience where we are brought to ethical reflection. When there's that specific experience, when we don't necessarily we don't intend to look at something as a painting to just be hanging there on the wall. We don't have the intention of looking. The same way the artist was just dabbing colors without really intending to make an art. But the moment when those experiences come together, they overlap. There's the singular experience that when you see it, you don't necessarily have to buy it, art as a commodity. You just have to share it. Nowadays, people just take a photo and share it online. That experience of capturing the art and sharing it, hopefully, some people will also like it. In that sharing of that experience, I think that there is that ethical intention. When you have that experience and the artwork makes you look away, makes you look out the window, and then there is that experience that there is something that you need to do. You need to be responsible. You need to do something good. You need to contribute to make the institutions just. Okay, so I think that is the common thread in all arguments about or within aesthetics. So that's where they connect.
Okay.
Personal.
So thank you for that reflection. So there's certainly there's no question there. I don't know if they want to react.
Thank you. It's a question. I agree with you, but maybe just one comment. An artwork can elicit, because you used the word singular experience. As opposed to that, I think an artwork can elicit more than one meaning or experience. I mean, for example, if I look at a painting of Cezanne, I don't right away say, therefore we go to the streets and So it elicits a different experience compared to other artworks. So the degree of, we could perhaps also speak of degrees of alterity. I just made that up, but maybe. And so therefore we cannot equate one art with other artworks. So, but I do agree with you. It's just that maybe it's better to say plurality of experiences as opposed to a singular experience. But if what you mean by that is that an artwork could actually move us to bring ourselves together as a collectivity, then I also agree with that. Thank you.
Well, I just would like to share some of the thoughts that went through my mind as you were speaking. It's a bit magulo, never mind. First of all, I'm not really interested in the intentions of the artist, whether the filmmaker or the novelist or the painter. I'm more interested in the work itself, whether it's a poem, a novel, a film. In other words, I believe that the work should speak for itself. The author, the writer, the artist may have something to say. Usually he does have something to say, which may be helpful, but it's one statement together with other statements. It's I think the work that must speak for itself. That's why if you can watch at least to watch the films that I had mentioned, that would be the best. No? And whatever I said, whatever even Dardenne said in his journal about the films, that's just one point of view. Okay? But I think what's important is what the work, in this case the films, say. That's the first. The second point that rushed through my mind concerning the possible relationship between aesthetics and ethics, and for that matter, other disciplines in philosophy, even please forgive me for saying such a bad word, even metaphysics, is that old notion that I hope you don't mind if I mention this. It's almost like a crime or a sin to mention this. That the old notion of the transcendentals, how the good, the true, the one, and the beautiful are fundamentally one. Okay. My old metaphysics teacher used to tell us that. Ends at verum convertuntur. They're convertible. Okay, what the one and the good and the true and the beautiful. Okay, so that at some underlying level, some fundamental level, some transcendental level, okay, we really are concerned with another bad word. What is? What is? Essentialistic, patriarchal, etc. Okay? But what is? In the end, perhaps the wonder that Thomasine that elicits. Finally, what is this is all the experience of the mirandum, the wonderful. I think we need to take a look at that and maybe retrieve it. So that the ethics and metaphysics, perhaps, ethics and aesthetics, there's some commonality precisely on that fundamental level. I recall also that another definition, proud, outdated, politically incorrect, and that sort of thing. But the splendor, beauty as the splendor of form. The splendor of form. Okay? And when we speak of form, okay, it's a notion I think that's operative in metaphysics, but also in ethics. Okay? And if we try to reflect on that with all our baggage and all that, but perhaps there is something to be retrieved there. Okay? I think Dr. Bolaños already mentioned mimesis and all that. After all, I mean, the old Aristotle, I mean, ethics, aesthetics, metaphysics, I mean, you can't avoid Aristotle, no? But precisely, perhaps there are certain notions, okay, which, although covered with a lot of dust and perhaps even garbage, but which can still, with some brushing up, can still provoke us and stimulate us to thought.
So we can still entertain a few more questions.
Good afternoon, sir. I'm Richard Gloria. I was actually a former student of Levinasian 15 years ago. So, anyway, Mr. Calasanz, Professor Calasanz, so you were speaking, actually, I was Googling all your films. The Promise, Lorna, The Silence of Lorna, and then the Operating Table, is that correct, sir? The third film, sir, regarding the woman.
Unknown girl.
The unknown girl, yes. So anyway, I noticed that the characters in the film are actually engaged in shady pasts, or actually engaged in shady experiences. So they have actually, say for example, Lorna Silence, she was actually in a fixed marriage with a drug addict, and then she was trying to fix up, and then there was the African American girl with a missing, who's unknown, and then the other film, sir, The Promise, about taking care of the immigrants. Is that correct, sir? Okay, so anyway, I noticed that insofar as the Dardenne Brothers are concerned, they actually made these characters appear to have shady pasts. And then suddenly, an earthquake occurs, they experience the peace of the other. So suddenly they become responsible for it, and as you said, the responsibility or their obsession becomes, there's sudden obsession regarding the responsibility towards the other. So, do you think that insofar as the Dardenne Brothers are concerned, what they're trying to say is that regardless of who you are, your experiences, your religious beliefs, or your past, insofar as you are concerned, the moment that you experience the face of the other, everything changes. That suddenly, regardless of what you are doing on the side, regardless of what you are doing in your past, everything changes, and then you suddenly feel responsible for the other, regardless of what is happening around you.
Certainly. Jenny in the Unknown Girl, the physician, she's petit bourgeois. Lorna is a woman with a shady past, talagang kalapating mababa ang lipad, talagang putik-putikan na. But you have the characters in The Promise, but for example, in The Kid with a Bike, the heroine Samantha is petit bourgeois. She's a hairdresser, very respectable. In other words, the experience of responsibility, the epiphany of the face hits anyone, and precisely because it hits what is human, cutting across. In a certain sense, one can say that the face is transcendental. No? In that sense, it cuts across boundaries, it cuts across regions. No? It addresses the human. And I think that's one of the, powerful aspects of art, whether film, the novel, drama, painting. It has this peculiarity, it has this universal dimension, okay, addressed to all, to use a cliche, addressed to the whole universe, on the one hand. But on the other hand, it's very particular. It's very even singular. You know, I think if you're looking for an example of what philosophers have been searching for as the concrete universal, it's something like that. No? It's very concrete, very singular. In fact, the word is always singular. There's no other word like it. But at the same time, the openness to the infinite horizon of what is. Okay? And I think that's what makes art finally so mysterious. Okay? I get that experience, but if I go into a semi-confessional mode. No? My experience, for example, when I saw for the first time Akira Kurosawa's Ran, it's so recognizably Shakespeare, 16th century, English, and yet so Japanese, so Asian, and it's both. No? It's not one or the other. It's both. No? And I think there are works like that. That's why we call them classics. We call them great. No? They're able to cut across boundaries. No? And it's something finally very, very mysterious. No? As perhaps the mystery of art, it's not the same, but perhaps it symbolizes, can symbolize, it can be a figure of precisely the mystery that we experience in the epiphany of the face.
Yes, sir.
So good afternoon. I'm Lorenzo Estrella, seminarian from the Bosco Canlubang. I'd like to address the question to Professor Bolaños regarding on aesthetics and ethics. How would we make sense or reconcile or even make sense when a while ago it was mentioned about shock art now, so it goes beyond the traditional sense of art as being aesthetic, beautiful. So how would we reconcile or make sense? Pardon to say, show a religious biases when certain works of art would tread on religious lines, which we might call as blasphemous or sacrilegious. So how do we reconcile that? Those?
And therefore, at the end, after that, however, what ensues are debates, right? Like, for example, of course, I think you are, to some extent, you are referring to years ago when Cruz came up with this installation artwork. What ensued after that are debates which debates from the Senate, from the church, from the usual people. So, that's precisely the point of shock art. It does not need to be reconciled with our well-guarded presuppositions or values or whatever, because that's precisely the point of shock art, right? It has to show, it has to. Now, whether that is ethical or not, but precisely ethics is dialectical. It might not be ethical from the point of view of the church, but perhaps from the point of view of Adorno, it serves its purpose because look what happened after you've seen that installation artwork. You started questioning, society. You started questioning yourself. You started to question Miguel Cruz himself, and so that's the power. That's the power of art, of that kind of art. Now, do we need to reconcile it with our well-guarded values or our religion? You're just going to waste your time. It will not reconcile itself. It's not identical, right? It has its own alterity. So it's negative that way. And that's what art is, according to Adorno. Art is fundamentally negative. Of course, we can talk about degrees of negativity. Some artworks are not that blasphemous, perhaps, or not blasphemous at all. But there are artworks that to our minds are blasphemous precisely because they deal with sensitive images or issues, right? The effect. In other words, we engage, we begin to engage with the artwork because it's so different, it's so negative. It's because if it's something that we have to agree with all the time, it does not elicit anything. It stops being ethical. That's the point of Adorno. Now, ethics, therefore, of course, when we try to understand the notion of ethics, it's not ethics, and of course, Levinas also, when he talks about ethics, he's not talking about dogmatic ethics or dogmatic or moral ethics or something. I don't know how to call it, but you know what I'm talking about. It's almost blasphemous to say that, but you know what I'm talking about. Levinas talks about ethics. I said this yesterday in my opening remarks. Levinas offers us a model of ethics that is not beyond but prior to religion and law. It's so fundamental. It's so regardless of your religious background, right? You will have to face the other. So that it's a kind of ethics which you also find in Adorno. It's perhaps the common Jewish background talking there. So that's how I would respond to you.
Doc Leo has something to say.
First of all, I just want to thank both of you. I think I don't know if the audience agrees. I think this was a very good session. And I know Eddie Boy was telling me he came here for but years ago, I asked him to come back from France, and he asked me why, and I told him because of Levinas, responsibility for the other, and he exclaimed, "Butanginan Levinas." Anyway, I would like to. I actually have a question because I was surprised that I thank Paolo for comparing Levinas with Adorno, because usually in the article "Reality in its Shadow," Levinas is actually grappling with Heidegger, because his whole point was that the artwork actually demolishes a world and therefore creates another world where we are no longer being in the world, and therefore we are amazed, we are in wonder. And I think the Dardenne Brothers are creating other worlds, because I think both of you have shown us that we have to do the creative imagination of other worlds, that fiction, film are not about untruths, but it's expanding the truth. And I think this is very important to have a sense of the metaphorical, the symbolic. We don't have only one world, and I think this is where the two converge. And philosophy must do that, this productive imagination. In other words, we have to imagine other worlds, because I think we have to get out of this world. And maybe you could comment on this. The role of imagination is very important for philosophy.
And I would like to think it's very important, especially for ethics.
Yes.
To imagine possibilities. It's not always a question of dilemmas, no? But precisely to imagine even the excluded third. Well, that's one point. But I'd like just to go back to that point concerning blasphemy and shock art and that sort of thing, because it's perhaps not so much an issue in our country, but in other countries, not too far from ours, people get killed for the charge of blasphemy. Okay, so it's a life and death issue. And for the Christian, for one who tries to be a Christian, this is, I think, a very important issue because the founder of our religion was killed precisely on the charge of blasphemy. Okay. So we have perhaps to scratch more on the surface and find out what does that really mean. And if there's anything more shocking, I would like to think it's the image of our crucified God. It's sacrilegious, it's shocking, it's, of course, perhaps 2,000 years of Christian iconography and art have sort of attenuated that, have sort of made it a little sweeter and nicer. But perhaps we have to retrieve that shock and recover the truth that I think it was Nietzsche's, I'm not sure if it was Nietzsche or someone commenting Nietzsche, that Nietzsche's pithy statement that God is dead, that for the Christian, there is at least one day in the year that statement is absolutely true. And it's the day of Holy Saturday, when the corpse of God is in the tomb, and that the expression, the corpse of God, it's really the cadaver of God. And to recover the shock of that, I think we've domesticated the shocking parts of our faith, you know? And then finally, the last point I'd like to mention and to tie up with Levinas, the shock, the provocation, even the sacrilege of the presence of the poor, the widow, the orphan in our midst. Okay. The wounded one. Okay. Pope Francis insists that where do we touch the wounds of Christ? Today. Not 2,000 years ago, but today. Okay. In the wounds that are the poor. Okay. And I think we have to recover that sense of provocation, not just art, but the reality of the poor, the oppressed in our midst. Their presence is something sacrilegious, something blasphemous.
Okay, so one last question. It's coming from Father.
Thank you. I'm Roger. I'm very grateful. I don't know if the organizers of the conference were organized so that my lecture this morning and your lecture were comprehensive and illustrating the one and the other, vice versa. So thank you so much for the accident. But one remark came into my mind, or one idea. So also this morning I tried to explain that substitution, expiation, sacrifice, it's not the benevolence and a kind of nice benevolent instinct or something of an heroic altruism, but that it's our human condition. And so the films of Dardenne illustrate this remarkably. And then I remembered also the language of Levinas, and you remember as Leo Vino did yesterday, using the idea of liqueur, that Levinas uses a hyperbolic language. And till now, and now I will change my mind through your intervention. Liqueur suggests that the language of Levinas is hyperbolic. And this suggests that it is not true. That's the risk of the remark of liqueur, that when the language is hyperbolic, it becomes a strategy to say something beyond, but finally it's only hyperbolic, it's not true. But you now, today, through your comment, through Dardenne, and what I had in mind also this morning, but more through the films of Dardenne, it's very clear it's not hyperbolic, it's just real. Okay.
Yes, Dr. Bolaños.
Just, I wanted to comment actually on Doc Leo's, to respond to Doc Leo's comment earlier. And I was reminded, when I was listening to Professor Calasanz, I was reminded by a phrase given by Adorno. He says that the splinter in the eye is the best magnifying glass. So, of course, that's actually biblical. It's a biblical passage, it's probably an inflection from a biblical passage. But what that means to me is, as Professor Calasanz pointed out, ethics is, we begin to develop ethical consciousness because we are reminded that so we begin to develop our ethical consciousness at a very fundamental level, and what Levinas and Adorno mean by that is that through when Levinas says face to face, I think we could also imagine not only a face to face between two people, but for example, how would you, for example, feel if you were a soldier fighting in Marawi? Right? The visceral, the concreteness of the reality of war. So the best magnifying glass is the splinter in the eye. But if friendly fire will kill you, then you wouldn't be able to talk about war anymore. But you become a statistic. But now with regard to Doc Leo, I agree that art, in particular Adorno, he's preoccupied with art in terms of his preoccupation with music and also literature. As a matter of fact, he wrote 2 volumes on literature called Notes to Literature, and I guess he inherited this fondness with literature from Walter Benjamin and Georg Lukács. Lukács who wrote a book on the novel. And of course, he's also influenced by Ernst Bloch. So, literature, art, cinema, for example, what they incite are what I mentioned earlier. They incite utopian, visions, images that allow us to imagine something other than the wrong state of things. That's how art can be, one way that art can become ethical. Because art allows us to imagine the unimaginable. Art allows us to imagine, and like in film can actually, to some extent, bring us to the, the vision or the standpoint or perception of the character, right? And no other art form can do that aside from film. So, literally, film can put us in the shoes of the character. So, and I remember Benjamin's statement that, of course, he is critical of the mechanical reproduction of the work of art, but he also says, ironically, that this mechanical reproduction, as in film, of art, can broaden our cognitive horizon. So that means to me it can broaden not only cognitively, but also ethically. Thank you.
Okay, so we end. Although we still want to continue ad infinitum, but time is against us. So there are some announcements after the. Okay, so at this point, we will award the certificate to our 2 speakers. So this Reed the citation. So the University of Santo Tomas, through the Department of Philosophy of Faculty of Arts and Letters, awards this certificate of recognition to Eduardo Jose Calasanz of Ateneo de Manila University and Paolo Bolaños of the University of Santo Tomas for being paper presenter in the International Conference on the Philosophy of Emmanuel Levinas at the University of Santo Tomas. Paolo Bolaños, signed by Paolo Bolaños. So how will we do it? Who will be the other to sign your own certificate? So you are your own other. And then signed by Dr. Levino Garcia and Dr. Michael Anthony Basso. So again, a round of applause. And then before we leave, just a few announcements for our